Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, and welcome to today's webinar titled Follow the Money, an Introduction to Airport Finance. My name is Pinar Maurice, Marketing Coordinator at the Airport Consultants Council, and it is my pleasure to be the host of today's program. This is the third and final webinar of 2017 to be sponsored by the ACC Young Professionals Forum, and we have over 180 participants registered today. We're happy to see such a significant and continued growth with this initiative. First, for those not familiar with ACC, we are the International Trade Association that represents private businesses that help plan, design, operate, and supply airports across the country and around the world. ACC is the only association that represents the private sector businesses involved in airport development. We provide opportunities for members to receive technical training on a number of varying topics relating to airport development. We network and develop professional relationships with peers and airport clients, and we interface with decision makers at the FAA, TSA, and other federal agencies on regulatory guidance and advisory circular updates. The Young Professionals Forum is an extension of ACC, formed as a means to engage YPs in airport development and enhance their careers. We are very pleased to have such a strong leadership team that have provided many opportunities for the YPs to get involved. If you're interested in joining the forum, hosting an initiative, or getting involved with the leadership, you can sign up via a link that is on our YP Forum webpage. Before we begin, I have a few logistical items about the webinar. All participants on the call will be muted, and we encourage you to ask questions using the questions window on the right-hand side of your screen. Please also note that we'll send you a copy of the presentation along with a survey following the webinar. Finally, I want to remind you that you may notice a slight delay as I advance the slides. We appreciate your patience as we move through the presentation. Now, I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar host and moderator, Cody Parham with HDR. Cody is a project manager at HDR, specializing in aviation infrastructure and site development. He earned a civil engineering degree from the Georgia Institute of Technology and is a registered professional engineer. His recent industry involvement includes roles with the ASCE Airfield Pavement Committee, the ACC AAAE Planning, Design, and Construction Symposium, and the Florida Airports Council. Cody will also be our Young Professionals Forum Vice Lead for 2018. And with that, I will turn over the program to Cody, who's going to go ahead and introduce today's webinar.
Thanks, Pinar. We're here today to talk about airport finance. And in short, finance is the way that airport owners fund their businesses. And it's also the engine that drives our entire industry. As YPs, we don't always have a clear understanding of who is paying for our work or why some projects get built while others never get off the ground. Well, I hope that we can shed some light on the inner workings of our industry today. We have three experts with us discussing the financial structure of airports, their capital improvement programs, and some common capital funding sources. Our goals are to help you understand the fundamentals of airport finance and how funding sources affect you as a consultant. Now I will introduce our panelists for today. Next slide. Dafang Wu will provide an introduction to airport finance. Dafang is the Associate Director of DWU Consulting. He has more than 17 years of experience in airport finance. He has been involved in the issuance of more than $8 billion of airport bonds and has worked for capital programs from Boston to Hawaii. Dafang is a chartered financial analyst and a member of the ACI NA Finance Committee Steering Group. Thanks for being here, Dafang. Lou Wolnitz will be discussing airport capital programs. Lou is the aviation finance lead for WSP USA. He's served clients on 5 continents on a variety of transportation finance services. Lou recently worked on assessing delivery options for the LAX People Mover, a project recently featured on our last YP webinar. He is a regular speaker and writer on airport finance and performance improvement and holds degrees from UNC Chapel Hill and Cornell. Welcome, Lou. Our final speaker is Gavin Fonestock, Senior Airport Planner with CHA Consulting. Gavin brings the unique perspective of someone who has overseen the $3.35 billion airport improvement program for the FAA. He assisted in the development of an FAA order, which provides guidance on development of airport capital improvement programs. Gavin just recently rejoined the private sector and has returned to his planner roots. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. Now I'd like to start by inviting Dafang Wu to provide our introduction to airport finance.
Yeah, thank you, Cody. Good morning and good afternoon. This is Dafang Wu. I'm an airport financial consultant. So several weeks ago, I showed Cody the first draft of my presentation and read it through and saying, this looks quite impressive, but how is this related to me? Then I read the presentation and realized that it probably really has nothing to do with him or what he wants to hear. So I rewrite the presentation to just answer one question. Is if you work for capital planning or capital project, why would you want to know airport finance, and what do you want to know about this one that can help your work? So next slide, please. So in order to implement a major capital program, all three pieces of planning have to come together. Those are facility planning, financial planning, and business planning. So we can design the best terminal in the world, but if there is no money for it, then it's not a useful exercise. Similarly, if the airlines or rental car users or any users of the facility don't want to participate and don't want to use it, then the facility will not be built either. So in order to do any capital program, all three pieces have to come together and actually have to move at the same time before we put the shovel in the ground. Next one, please. So what we're doing on capital planning side has a tremendous impact on my financial planning work. That's really because airports are pretty capital intensive. ACINA does a biannual survey every year. The latest one is in January or February 2017. They find out the US airport industry needs $100 billion over the next 5 years for capital program. That's about $20 billion each year planned. Actual spending is a little bit lower than that, but it's still a very significant amount we need to invest. And in addition, the airport needs to spend money maintaining those facilities and operating those facilities. So every time, if there is a capital program, the airport wants to maximize all the external funding sources first, which is what Lo and Gavin will talk about in the following session. So other than that, we need to rely on airport revenue funds to fund the majority of the cost, especially at large airports. So all those debt service on the bond needs to be repaid over 30 years or longer. So it's a major decision to issue a bond for a major program. So the non-airline revenues, when we implement the program, could be fairly limited. So in that case, we need to get more money from airlines to fund the program. Then the question becomes, well, can we really charge airline whatever necessary to fund the program? Next one, please. So the answer is not really. So in this country, we're so heavily regulated, not only on the planning side, but also on the financial side. So basically, there are only two ways we can recover money from the airline. The first one is called a residual. Basically means the airlines will pay whatever necessary to keep us running. So you can imagine for this kind of residual methodology, you must negotiate with the airlines. We can't walk up to an airline and say, from today going forward, you are going to pay all my bills. That doesn't sound like anything reasonable. So that has to be done through a bilateral agreement. On the other side, we can implement something called compensatory. Compensatory just means the airport takes over all the responsibilities on the financial side. So we'll charge airlines for whatever we use, then at the same time, we'll collect the non-airline revenues and all the other revenues to make sure we always have enough money. Compensatory in that case, it doesn't need to be negotiated. You could possibly do a unilateral calculation of the compensatory. So as you can see, if it's a residual, technically you have unlimited funding capacity. If the airline agrees to it, then you may proceed. But on the compensatory, that is not the case. So let's move to the next one. On the facility planning side, I guess the secret is attention to detail. You're trying to fit a facility on the existing footprint, considering all the constraints. But on financial side, we try to simplify everything. So we look at the airport, regardless of what it is, we only see three pieces, which is airfield, terminal, and everything else, or we call that land side. So for airfield, because it's fenced, only the aviation users use it. So we say it has to be fully recovered from airlines. Terminal is a mixed use. Airlines use a portion of that one, but under the compensatory, they do not pay for vacant space or any concession space. So in that case, in the terminal side, a lot of times you see a deficit. On the land side, that's what we make money from the parking and the rental car. So for compensatory rate making, the secret is always whether we can generate enough from land side to offset the terminal structure. So when you think about the compensatory, well, there could be a hard limit on how much money you can spend on a capital project. Let's go to the next one, please. This is the most important slide on the airport finance. It's basically talk about what's the financial objective of an airport. The first one is always we need enough money to pay all the bills. But other than that, we have three conflicting objectives. Those are improving financial positions, meeting capital needs, and maintaining attractive airline rates. So if you have a program that is feasible under compensatory, I can run a financial model and show we have enough revenue. But if it leads to astronomical airline rates and charges, then the facility will not be built. In most cases, we're facing a conflicting situation there and how to make some trade-offs. For example, if you want to spend $1 billion on your terminal, then your financial will suffer, then your airline rates will go up. But if that's what you need, then you just have to go ahead and proceed with the terminal. So in many cases, we have to measure that trade-off. So let's move to the next one, please. So let's look at what we already have to pay. This is even before we think about anything incremental. So for the whole industry in fiscal year 2016, they spent about $13 billion on the operating and the maintenance expense, and an additional $7 million on debt service, so roughly $20 billion in total. So personnel services, which are the ones we pay the employee, is the largest component, followed by the contractual services. Those are the money paid for your maintenance contractors, for planning consultants, and all the consultant work, as well as all the third-party service providers. So when the airport prepare a budget on the operating expense, they could do either an incremental budget, they take last year's budget to do some changes, or they can do a zero-based budget, trying to justify every single line in their budget. So after they do the calculation, they calculate the rate and charges using the expense. Then in that case, they submit both the budget and the rates to their governing body and the airlines for review. Then eventually it will be, finally the final budget will be published with the rates. So as we see from the bottom, in fiscal year 2016, the airport spent about $10 billion on capital projects. About half of that amount is collected from both the AIT grants and PFC, but the airport still needs to borrow about $7 billion in bonds just to fund their capital project. Next one, please. This shows an example of the airport operating budget and the rate calculation. You can Google this one to find it online. On the left side is an operating budget, about 300, 400 pages thick. So it shows every details of the airport by division by line item. On the right side, you'll see a summary of airport rates. Every year, the airport takes the budget on the left side, adding in the debt service, non-airline revenues, and calculate what we need to charge each airline for. And that's shown on the right side. Next one, please. So after we know how much money we need to pay, then we look at how much money the airport collected. In 2016, the airport collected about $21 billion in total. So if you recall, we spent about $20 billion together on operating expenses and debt service. So there's almost no profit on the airport operation side. Passenger airline payments is the largest component. From the right side, you can see that this ratio is quite different for the airport of different size. For a very small airport, you can generate a lot of like land rentals and building rentals, which will make account for majority of your income. But for the large hub airport, the size of the airport is limited, and they need to invest billions in their terminal facility. So in that case, the passenger airline payment actually is the major component of the revenue. Let's go to the next one, please. So then we have, every year we're looking at a long list of preferred capital projects. So when we think about which capital projects will be built, then we need to revisit our objectives. If you have a project that satisfies all the objectives, then it will be built. For example, if you're looking at a parking garage, if you move into the garage and generate more revenue, then it's an ideal project. But most projects involve a trade-off. Then we need to evaluate what's the impact to the airline, either on the CPE side or other financial ratios. If you can figure out a way to mitigate those effects, like improving the airline efficiency or reduce the flight delays and other issues, those will be all helpful to make a capital decision. Next one, please. So one thing to note is the capital project is probably the only reason that disrupts the airline and the airport relationship. That's really because the airport investment is quite a time-consuming and cyclical. When airport completes a major project, it will definitely have more capacity than today's needs. But airlines have higher cost of capital, so they don't want to pay anything than absolutely necessary. So at some airport, you can proceed without airline support. But if you Google the news of recent years, every struggle between the airline and the airport is pretty much because of a major capital program. So that's how we say the capital planning has such a tremendous impact on everything we're doing. Next one, please. So this is the takeaway slide. We're saying for the capital funding, our financial resources is limited. So first thing we need to figure out is whether the airport is on a residual basis or a compensatory basis. If it's a compensatory basis, then you may have a hard stop on the funding capacity. Either way, so then we need to evaluate the impact on airline rates and see how that fits into our objectives. There is a much longer and boring presentation about Finance 101 on my website, and there are also a lot of additional material there. So if you're interested, you can go to take a look. So if you have any questions, please send me an email. Thanks.
Thank you, Dafang. Now that we've had a general introduction to airport finance, I'd like to invite Lou Wolanetz to discuss airport capital improvement programs. Take it away, Lou.
Thanks a lot. And after that nice overview of how airports look to manage budgets and get their money, it's the goal here is to provide some information about how they plan and spend that money wisely to maximize the utilization of the resources that are available and maximize the lifespan of assets. You can go to the next slide, please. So I think airports are really interesting. One of the reasons we're all probably involved with them is they're mini cities in a lot of ways. In addition to the airfield, which is unique to airports, you have buildings, you've got roads, you've got transit, you've got utilities, you have fire and police on site, you deal with IT, you deal with land use. And so that's a pretty big pot of different things to consider when you're doing your capital planning. And each of them has various ways that they can be funded, various rules to be aware of. Each of them has ways that are typical in those industries for delivering projects and maintaining and operating and renewing those assets. So those are some of the things that I'll be touching on as we go forward. Next one, please. And part of what makes airports interesting is the airport itself is, in a lot of ways, a landlord that enables private activity to happen. So the airport owns most things or has oversight of them, but you've got airlines, rental cars, concessions, hotels, all sorts of folks who have their own businesses at the airport that are not in direct control of the airport. And that colors really everything that the airport is doing from a financial perspective. So one of the first things to deal with in figuring out your capital funding is who owns what. So as Dafang was saying, the airfield almost always is owned, at least in the U.S., by the airport, by the public. Terminals are usually, but not always, owned by the airport. You get situations like the JFK International Terminal, where private companies may own and operate terminals. Concessions, the concessions themselves, the space may be owned by the airport, but the concessionaires, of course, are building those out, have their own equipment and their own operations, and so forth with security and customs, border control, FAA, lots of different actors in there. Other aviation facilities outside the passenger are usually not owned by the airport directly. They may own the land, but cargo, general aviation, FBOs may be owned privately. The federal government has facilities. This is all important context. And then ground transport, I touched on. Parking may or may not be airport owned. You may have off-site competition as well to be aware of. Rental cars may be owned by the airport in a consolidated facility, or the sites, as in LA right now, may be completely privately owned. And then there's the dynamic of airport access. Airports are responsible right up to the property line and not an inch further, and the local regional planning agencies are responsible for the reverse, and so there's an interface issue there. And then rail, an airport's not usually going to operate mass transit. They might operate a people mover, but they often will build assets, stations, and the like. And then all the private companies that are there that I mentioned, including the airlines themselves. So that is important context as well. Next one, please. So how do we deal with that and put a capital plan together that makes sense given the cash flows that Fang was talking about coming in? And one way to think about it is there's different time frames. There's the long term, which is, developing the layout plan and the master plan, sort of the vision of what the airport's going to become. A medium-term plan, which is usually about a 5-year capital improvement plan with what are the things we're working towards getting our grants and our PFC applications in to fund now, getting our contracts out. And then the current year, the current budget, and that's what that wheel is there that you see in the picture. It's a Houston Airport's budgeting process, and just kind of how all the steps they go through each and every year, each and every month to make not only their capital plan work, of course, but their operations. And inside of that planning, obviously a lot of priorities to consider. Number one is making sure that the airport is open, that FAA regulatory security requirements are met, that people and airplanes can get where they need to be. And then the important things that are not necessarily critical priorities, but are very important, are customer service and amenities. I got some pictures there of a play area at BWI and a private place for feeding babies that you're starting to see pop up in some airports. Things that you didn't think about. Now you have to find a way to fund these amenities if you want to be competitive. And then on capital planning, 2 types of planning to consider: expansion or growth versus maintenance and renewal. And that's particularly important since you've got a lot of airports out there that unfortunately maintenance has not kept up with needs, and there are aging facilities and need those funds, which can be harder to come by than growth funds. And so all that leads to different processes with different roles. Obviously, the vision is set by the board and the political oversight of the airport and senior staff that manages that, but consultants, of course, have a key role to play in making sure that that vision can be realized and helping the client and the airport adjust where resources are too limited, whether that's by phasing, whether it's by doing better maintenance, whether it's by growing revenue. So that's the key role to play there. Next one, please. And coming back to the concept of airports as a city is, in this context, everyone has an opinion. Unlike other assets that you may work with in your career, especially in infrastructure, like a toll road or a port or utility systems, where as long as they're there, people are fine with it. Airports are part of the community. People know them, people use them, people have likes and dislikes, and they're not shy about calling up their representatives and making their opinions known. So you've got kind of split this into 4 buckets. You've got the actual users who are doing things or running their businesses at the airport, including the airlines, the tenants, pilots, the concessionaires. You've got the stakeholders, by which I mean the customers, the passengers, the community, and the general public, the regulators, who have oversight and have to make sure everything is operating as it should, and then a lot of advocacy groups that all have their own take on things. And all that has to be managed, and unfortunately, life being what it is, that comes into the budgeting process, whether it is approvals, whether it's grants, whether it's flexibility to manage things at the airport level, or depending on how the airport is owned, there's a heavier hand from the city or county that owns the airport. Next one, please. So some of the challenges that come into capital planning then, and these are all things that sort of are increasingly challenging over time. The big one is at the top that I mentioned, the aging assets, and this was really just an excuse to have a picture of Joe Biden telling us that LaGuardia was a third world airport. But that actually created some movement. So partly because of that, the governor got behind the redevelopment that's going on right now for LaGuardia. So it shows that things that have been tried to be planned for years and years, the Port Authority was unable to make that redevelopment happen until there was that top-down political pressure. I think there's other issues here that are really important. What's going on in the industry with consolidation. While the airports are doing great and big airports are doing great, mid-size and small airports have to figure out how to meet needs while also not being able to count on air service and passenger volumes being consistent. You see a lot of airports that have boom and bust cycles, and how do you manage that? The pilot shortage that is affecting regional carriers makes that more challenging. And the overall story then is that the airports are being asked to do more with less. We all know PFCs haven't gone up in a long time. Hopefully they will soon. AIP, we're still waiting on a new bill, but is unlikely to go up. So more has to be done at the local level. Next one, please. So how do we actually pay for things? I've labeled this the traditional funding mechanisms, and it's kind of a four-part series. PFCs, critical funding source for capital, cannot be used for operations, but they can be leveraged as debt. And the markets, after initial uncertainty, are very accepting of PFC debt. It can be leveraged in a bond on its own, or in conjunction with other cash flows, and used to bring funds forward for a project. Customer facility charges, most notably for rental cars, but can also be for other items, or for capital. They can also be used for operations as long as they're related to the asset, and can be leveraged, again, on their own or in conjunction with others. Airport revenue is kind of the big everything else. Concessions, whatever fees the airport is able to collect, depending on their airline agreement, certain funds coming from airlines, but anything else they have can be used in these ways. And then grants, obviously critical, whether it's entitlements with AIP, and you'll hear more about AIP after this, but making sure those flows are coming in. The thing with grants, though, is they can only use for capital projects, and that's great, but you can get in situations where you build something nice and new, and then operating it becomes a challenge. I got one example of a small airport that got a grant to put in a really great baggage system. This was not too long after 9/11, got all this money, free baggage system, sounds great, but it cost way more to operate than their prior system, and eventually they had to shut it down. They're like, well, hand carry bags if it's going to be this expensive. So next one, please. You hear a lot about innovative funding or financing. I like to say that if we're that innovative, everyone will be doing it and no longer be innovative. So I think it's hard to say that there's anything truly innovative out there, but there are things that are not in that traditional bucket. Some things to keep in mind are, coming back to the airports as cities concept, airports are multimodal. There are funds that are, especially federal funds, that are targeted towards surface transportation that can be eligible for road and rail access. Grant programs such as the Tiger grants and infra grants can be used and have been used on airports for eligible projects. Airport access fees is an important one. Parking and rental car are two huge drivers of airport funding, and both have an uncertain future. as we have more Uber and Lyft and TNCs, as we head towards autonomous vehicles in the next couple decades, how people are accessing the airport may change, and it may change permanently, which affects revenue. So one way to overcome that could be charging a fee to access the airport, congestion pricing that fee, so you pay more at peak periods than an off-peak. These are some ideas that are not, in the US at least, much utilized, but I think we'll start to see in the near future. And another one is big data. And this, with the technology revolution, opens up new funding sources. If you've been through San Juan recently, well, you probably wouldn't notice, but there is a camera that tracks all the movement of the passengers through ticketing and check-in and going through security and through the terminal. And they can identify certain the passengers electronically. And that data can be sold to airlines so that you can help improve their process. How many kiosks do you really need for check-in? How can security be improved? So there are opportunities like that coming, and even today. And then financing, you hear a lot about public-private partnerships, or P3. I'll get into that in a second. But certainly in certain aspects that can be useful. Availability payment is a structure by which a private party takes risk for the development and operation of an asset, but not for how much revenue is generated. And what they're doing at Los Angeles on the land side is a classic example of that. It's a people mover system being built privately, but how many people ride it is not the issue for the private sector. Just having it up and open and operating, and they will get paid. And infrastructure banks, many states have these. They're typically targeted for smaller projects. I don't think they really think of airports when they design them, but that doesn't mean airports aren't eligible. And in Florida, for example, the infrastructure bank has funded small projects at airports. So there are other things out there. Next one. So how do we deliver projects, which is intricately linked with how we fund projects? And this is the table. A blue solid dot means it's handled by the private sector, and a white dot means that the public sector is handling a particular issue. So the traditional design, bid, build, the public sector handles everything. And then as we go down, we get more and more private sector involvement with design build, with the design and construction. There's risks taken by the private sector for those elements. Design, build, operate, maintain, where they do the design and construction as well as the follow-on operations. And then the true sort of P3 is at the bottom. Design, build, finance, operate, maintain, either with an availability payment, as I just explained, or a revenue risk P3. And that is a sort of a true P3 where the airport or the private consortium running the airport is entitled to receive the fees and takes the risk that if they're short, that is on their problem, that is their equity or their debt that will not be repaid. And in the U.S., that can only happen through the privatization pilot program, which is now ongoing in San Juan. That's really the first and only success story there. But it can happen not just with a full airport, but with smaller assets, such as a terminal, and JFK is a good example there. The design build finance is another nuance in there. That's what's going on in Kansas City with the terminal that's just been voted on to go forward there. So many different options. The thing I like to emphasize is these are delivery mechanisms. They don't create money. There still has to be airport money, whether it's generated from fees or grants or other sources to pay for whatever's being built. But different mechanisms adjust the risk for each entity, the public and the private side, and who takes which risk and who is best able to manage that risk. Next one, please. A word about asset management as we come to the end here. All over public infrastructure, airports no exception. People tend to focus on getting things built and opened and cutting ribbons. It makes people happy, the politicians get excited. But most of an asset's life, it is open and operating. And thinking about that even before it's built is really critical to good financial management. 65 to 85% of all life cycle costs are locked in during the design and procurement stage. That means there's only so much you can do After that, there still are things you can do to better manage your assets, to make sure you're tracking them, to invest properly in maintenance, and to strategically know what the most important places to put money are, to know when it makes more sense to replace an asset versus rehabilitate it. And there are really good techniques that, frankly, the U.S. is behind on, in part because of our public ownership of airports, but international airports and other types of infrastructure use asset management techniques to really drive more value from their revenue, from their funds over the life cycle of the asset. And then, of course, there's operating costs, which I mentioned. They tend to be forgotten, but go try and get a grant to fund operations. It's not allowable. So you really got to keep an eye on the ball there, or fees go up. And the last one, please. So, and the last thing I want to emphasize, just as a wrap up, is there are just great resources out there, really, really good ones. I've highlighted a few, but there's certainly many more. ACC developed a really neat guide, the owner's guide to project delivery systems. I was involved in writing the second edition of it, which really goes through all the different systems, the pros and cons and ups and downs, and that's available free online. ACRP, the Airport Cooperative Research Program, has literally dozens of reports. I highlighted a couple here that are related to capital planning and innovative finance, but almost any little niche you're interested in, there's a report on, and if there's not, you can put in a problem statement, and it might get accepted and funded for future research. Airports, of course, the nice thing about working with numbers is they tend to be public and easy to find. So financial reports being available on websites. Board meetings are a great way, even if you can't attend. A lot of airports, particularly big ones, post their presentations and minutes online, so you can track what's happening if you're interested in what's going on with financing a project at at an airport, and what the decision points are. And I think the biggest thing is that people really want to help in the industry. Just by being on this call and involved with ACC, obviously, folks have taken a first step towards, or a step towards engaging that community. But being on committees, finance committees with ACC, with other industry organizations, are very open, and people really want to help get people educated. So people get very tied to the internet at times, and at times it's good to pick up the phone or go to a conference and talk to some friends in the community. So hope that answers some questions, probably creates more, and happy to answer those later.
All right, thank you, Lou, and thank you for those plugs for the ACC resources and meetings, so appreciate that. So we've talked about general finance, and we've talked about how airports fit their capital needs into that process. Now I'd like to invite Gavin Fahnestock to talk a little bit more about the most common capital finance programs, that being the FAA's Airport Improvement Program and the Passenger Facility Charge. Gavin?
Great. Thanks, Cody. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specific programs that the FAA offers for financing or funding the capital projects at an airport. And like Lou mentioned a little bit earlier, these programs are for capital development, so these are not going to be used for maintenance or operations of the airport. Next slide. So I'm going to touch a little bit about what the Airport Improvement Program is, what it does, how it's managed, what funding is available, what the obligations are, or the strings that come attached to an AIP funded project, and then I'll touch a little bit about the Passenger Facility Charge Program as well. Next slide. So the Airport Improvement Program provides grants to public agencies. In some cases, there are private owners or entities that will receive grants. Not so much nowadays, but in all cases, the Airport Improvement Program grants are going to be for public use airports, and public use airports that are also within the NIPIAS. The NIPIAS identifies existing proposed airports and identifies their needs. Tefeng touched a little bit earlier on the capital needs of all the airports in the nation. The NIPIAS also identifies the needs within all the eligible airports. Below, you'll find a little bit of the history with the Airport Improvement Program. It's not always been the AIP. It has developed over time from different programs and has become more focused on certain aspects. Next slide. So the Airport Improvement Program funds a lot of different types of projects within an airport. There's eligible projects and then there's ineligible projects. The Airport Improvement Program Handbook, or the statute for the Airport Improvement Program, will cover what is eligible. So it's also known as a permissive statute. So if you find a project that you're looking for funding for and you read through the Airport Improvement Program Handbook, or the AIP Handbook, you'll find the items that you can fund. You're not going to find a list of the items that you cannot fund. So that's what it means to be a permissive statute. Next slide. So some of the items that can be funded are things like snow removal equipment, runways, of course, taxiways, aprons, a lot of the airside items. Basically anything that's not going to be exclusive use within the airport. So once you get into the terminal, you get into a little bit of different questions of what is eligible and what's not eligible. There's also different levels of eligibility depending on the type of airport that you have. So for a larger airport, we're going to focus, or the FAA is going to focus more on the infrastructure. At the smaller airports, the FAA is also concerned with the airport being financially stable. So they want to have revenue sources. So in those cases, the FAA would find eligible revenue producing projects such as fuel farms or aircraft hangars. But of course, if you're going to do those kinds of projects, you have to fund the airside needs first. So here's just some pictures about the types of projects that are funded typically through AIP. Next slide. So the AIP is managed by the Office of Airports, the Financial Assistance Division. There's one office and headquarters that really manages the Airport Improvement Program, and then there's 9 regional offices and 21 district offices across the country which implement the program. It's a pretty small staff within the FAA that manages the programs, but they're very effective in distributing and overseeing the program and the funds as well. Any project that's seeking funding through the AIP has to be prioritized. So there's a national prioritization system. This system, by the way, is not applicable to PFC projects. This is just applicable to AIP projects. That national priority system, of course, is going to take into account safety projects first. So capacity, safety, security, noise, those are always going to be the highest priority projects for the FAA fund. There's always reasons that can be provided, or qualitative reasons that can be provided, that would also go into the priority of a project. But the equation or the system is based purely on capacity, safety, security, noise being the highest priorities. Next slide, please. So how much funding is available through AIP? The AIP program over the past 10 years, 10 plus years, has been over $3 billion. So that's $3 billion being funded at 75% of a project's an eligible project cost at the major airports, or 90% today at the smaller airports. Those percentages do change over time. For instance, at a general aviation airport, right now it's 90% that the FAA will fund. It used to be 95%. So depending on the legislation, that could change. As Dafeng mentioned before, there are some other funding sources such as PFCs, bonds, and things like that, but this is the funding source that's available through AIP. Some of the interesting things that you can notice on that chart below is the spike in the funding available around 2001. That's actually when the non-primary entitlement program was introduced. So prior to that point, the smaller airports were not receiving that $150,000 on an annual basis that they could put towards their eligible projects. Provided that the program stays over $3.2 billion, those non-primary entitlements will continue. If the program were to be authorized at a lower amount, those non-primary entitlements would actually go away. Next slide, please. So if you could actually just go ahead and click through these slowly. So where does the money come from? So the money that is going out in AIP grants is actually coming from within the within aviation. It's one of the great things about aviation is that the funding really stays within the system. If you weren't aware, the AIP program is actually one of the only government programs that's actually almost fully funded by the sector that it's serving. So not a lot of the money that goes towards funding the FAA on an annual basis comes from the government's general fund. I'd say about 85% of it comes from within the aviation industry. So that money is coming through the Airport and Airway Trust Fund through ticket taxes, fuel taxes, and other kinds of taxes. You'll typically see those kinds of things on your airline ticket. You'll see a line item for the ticket tax. That will then be transferred into the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. If you can go ahead and click through. That money then goes back out into the system and funds the improvements at the airports, which then generate more revenue into the system by more users that will then continue to go through the system. Next slide, please. So in the past few years, there's been about $3.35 billion that's been authorized for the Airport Improvement Program. That money gets split over the approximately 3,300 existing NIPIAS airports. There's over 14,000 airports within the United States, but only about 3,300 of them are NIPIAS airports. The funding goes out in about 2,000 grants per year, about 2,700 to 3,000 different projects at those airports. And the funding is issued typically to the cities, counties, airport authorities, any of the public owners, or in some cases, the private owners. There's two basic types of AIP funding. There's entitlements or discretionary. Entitlements are all what you would be considered formula funds. So if you read through the AIP statute, you'll find that there's very specific calculations that have to be done to determine how much an airport or a state is entitled to receive. The other funding source is discretionary. There's also a large piece of discretionary funding that is formula-based, but then there's also what's considered pure discretionary, that's the leftover discretionary. The larger portion of that is that formula-based, and it goes to funding certain special set-aside programs, such as the military airport program that has slightly different eligibility, the noise mitigation or voluntary airport low emission program. There's also programs for soundproofing or gate electrification and energy efficiency. Those are some types of fundings that discretionary is set aside for. Of course, discretionary funding is meant to go towards the highest priority needs of the FAA, which is capacity, safety, security, and noise. Next slide. When you accept an AIP grant, there's definitely going to be strings attached. That's part of the reason that you're getting that grant. Some of those strings come in the form of what's called a grant assurance. So whenever a grant is signed by a sponsor, they agree to certain terms and conditions. Things like conformity plans and specifications. So that means that the airport's going to conform to the plans and specifications that are developed by in-house or by their consultants. Those plans and specifications have to meet certain criteria and advisory circulars developed by the FAA. You're also going to agree to things like airport revenues. So like Dafeng was mentioning before about rates and charges, there is government oversight about how those rates and charges are set. Some other ways, some other obligations that aside from accepting an AIP grant would be a surplus property conveyance or other conveyances. That would be the airport receiving property from some owner. Usually, most airports have been conveyed to cities, counties, governments through the military. Each one of those different obligations have different durations. Most grants that you receive, that an airport receives, will have a 20-year obligation from the point when the grant is signed. So if you're constructing a runway, rehabilitating a runway, the airport now has an obligation for 20 years. There's some that go on in perpetuity. So land that's conveyed, they sign an obligation to have that airport open and operating as an airport in perpetuity. The FAA will then enforce those obligations through a different branch called the Airport Compliance Office. Next slide. So I'm going to touch a little bit about the passenger facility charge program, but this is definitely not my expertise, so I'll only touch a little bit. The passenger facility charge program is actually administered by the airport. it's not federal money. The federal government only oversees the program and approves the projects. Right now, passenger facility charge can be charged up to $4.50 per in-plane passenger. So you also see that on your ticket. It's being collected by the airlines, it's being managed by the airport. It never comes to the federal government, it never goes to the Airport and Airway Trust Fund. The difference between the PFC program and the AIP program is there's some differences in eligibility. The PFC program can fund a few different types of projects, and I'll cover that in the next slide, but also the magnitude of the recipients. So if you saw before, the AIP grants are issued to over 3,300 airports throughout the United States. PFC program is only open to those that are collecting PFCs, which right now is about approximately 356 locations. And 96 of the top 100 airports are currently collecting PFCs. So it's a huge program for those larger airports. Next slide. Some of the benefits of the PFC program are the broader eligibility. Where AIP is eligible to fund terminal projects and only those areas of the terminal that are public use, the PFCs have a slightly larger eligibility. So a PFC could fund something such as a gate area or ticket counters, where the AIP couldn't. PFC collections have been exceeding $2 billion annually. To give you an idea, though, in 2016, PFC collections were $3.164 billion. So that's almost matching the AIP program on an annual basis, but a difference of 3,300 airports being eligible to 356. So this program is huge for those larger airports that are collecting these funds. And then right below there, you can see some of the requirements for a PFC program. So they have slightly different eligibility and justification requirements. There's also different collection rates for a PFC. Not everyone is going to collect at a $4.50 rate. A lot of projects only qualify for collecting at $3. So there are different requirements for the PFC program that you have to prove when you're applying for a project. So I'm sorry I don't have a slide after this to cover some other resources, but I would definitely recommend that you take a look at the Airport Improvement Program Handbook, which can be found on the FAA's website, and the PFC Program Handbook, which can also be found there. Thanks.
Thank you, Gavin. That now concludes the presentation segment of the webinar. We will have a question and answer session immediately following some comments from myself and Pinar. So feel free to submit those questions via the chat box, so we'll have those ready to go. Quick note, I'd like to invite everyone on the call, if you are interested to submit your name for consideration as next year's ACC YP webinar coordinator. It's a great opportunity to get involved with the organization and to meet people at the forefront of our industry. And I can personally attest, it's a great way to, if you're not sure about getting involved, or maybe you don't get approved for travel, it's a great way to get involved without having to your company spend a lot of money. So if that's something that interests you, please email Pinar Maurice at the address provided on the screen.
Thanks, Cody. Right before we head into some questions, I just want to cover some upcoming ACC activities that will be taking place over the next several months. Just in general, our forum hosts quarterly conference calls with guest speakers that inform you of future activities and discuss our new initiatives and hot topics. Again, you can sign up for that and those emails on our website. There will also be a variety of YP programs held at the ACC AAAE Planning, Design, and Construction Symposium from February to March 1st in Denver, Colorado. Again, you can get more information on that on our website or on the link that is provided on the presentation. We'll also be setting up some regional meetups come 2018. Should you be interested in hosting one, please send me an email at pinarm@acconline.org. And as we're getting some questions in, we'll go ahead and move forward into that. Cody.
Okay. So the first question is for Gavin, and the question is, what will happen to the FAA funding mechanisms if the government shuts down?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, I don't know the correct answer to it right now. Earlier, we mentioned that I actually am no longer with the FAA. I actually am now with CHA Consulting, but in the past, what has happened is that there will be sort of kind of a break in the program, and then once the government comes back open or they pass some sort of omnibus bill or authorization, then the program will restart at whatever funding level that has been authorized. AIP is a little bit different than a lot of different government programs. It actually takes two different pieces of legislation to operate. There's an appropriations and then there's an authorization. The good thing right now is that there's an appropriations out there that goes the full year. There's an authorization that goes the full year, but there's no appropriations right now. That actually ends on December 8th, and then we'll see what happens closer to that date.
Okay, and Gavin, or I'm sorry, Lou or Dafang, do you have anything to add to Gavin's answer?
Well, this is Dafang. So basically, just as Gavin said, well, once you have a shutdown, but you are just seeing all those kind of like a part A, B, C, D, different kind of the entitlement. But eventually, well, we would need to assume the government will stop working. So it's just a procedural issues, although it's extremely annoying, especially if you have a construction project eligible for AIP, because you couldn't start until you got add funding there. Otherwise, it's not eligible for reimbursement.
I guess I would take a slightly different take, that whether it's a government shutdown or Superstorm Sandy or SARS or whatever else, things happen, and being prepared for those things is critical for an airport or any business operation, and that means having reserves and funds and a plan in place in case things like that do happen. Unless it drags on for a long time, which is sort of hard to envision. I don't think a government shutdown would really affect airports directly. Things should not be that day to day with their cash flow that it will affect them.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Lou. So Lou, I'd like your opinion on, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think, what capital projects will airports be spending their money on in the next 10 years in contrast to what they've been spending their money on over the past 10 years?
That's a really good question, and an interesting one. I would like to say that airports will be getting more entrepreneurial, following some of the examples of the more modern airports in Asia and Europe and elsewhere, to deliver really fantastic customer service in a way that hasn't necessarily been the focus before. But I think that's a great question to think about and discuss. I'm happy to discuss it offline. I can't say I have a brilliant answer right this minute.
I do realize I'm putting you on the spot, and that's a big $3 billion question a year, if not more. So okay, the next one relates to AIP, so we'll give Gavin the first crack at it. Can snow removal equipment from multiple airports be eligible for AIP funding if purchased together by an airport authority? What if the airports are different types, say a major and small airport with different reimbursement rates?
That's a great question, and the FAA has this challenge often of how they fund a project that covers multiple airports. So the short answer, if you're talking about a specific airport authority, is that yes, they can fund a single acquisition through a single grant. The difference is going to be which funding that the sponsor is going to use. So if you have an authority that has a primary airport and then has some GA airports, if the primary airport, if they're going to use the primary entitlement funds, then they can use that at all the airports. They can't use the non-primary entitlements at all of the airports. So they can't transfer it, let's say, from the GA to the primary airport. Now, the funding percentages are applicable by the airport type. So if it's the piece of equipment is being purchased by that large hub or the hub airport, it's going to be purchased at the 75% rate. the piece of equipment that's being used for that GA airport will be at the 90% rate. So it is going to be different for each of the airports. The funding that you can use can be from one or the other of the airport authorities' buckets. Now, there's also a difference between if a state is procuring a large amount of equipment, or even they could do studies such as pavement condition studies, and they can identify a study or piece of equipment or purchase or construction work really at a vast majority of the airports within the state. That would be a various locations grant. And those can be done under one contract through the state, and there can be one grant issued to the state, and that's going to be at a different percentage than it would be if the grant was going directly to a specific airport.
Okay, thank you, Gavin. The next question is for Dafong. Given the long-term nature of debt service, how are airports rethinking how they prioritize investments for major facilities? For example, considering CONRACs in the midst of the autonomous revolution. Are we seeing any topologies experiencing dramatic changes in how they are viewed in the CIP prioritization process?
I think basically for this question, the answer is similar to everything else. It's like depends. So at the current stage, there is a process prioritizing all the costs, all the bonds. First of all, if you have all the AMT bonds, which are more expensive, those are always paid before the non-AMT. So the airport tries to juggle those funds to make sure the higher cost is paid first. So secondly, when we think about the project, especially on the CONRAC side, most of the CONRACs actually, they have a 30-year debt service. But if you look at the collection speed, they probably will be paid much quicker than the 30 years. So it's really a project by project issue. But when we go talking about the revenue bond side, although we do the structuring each time, but inevitably the airport keeps spending. So in that case, you are always looking at a stable or even escalating debt service portfolio.
All right, thank you, Dafong. The next question, Gavin, I'm going to warn you is a little unfair, but I'm going to ask it anyway. This questioner is interested in the reason why the AIP program has stayed flat around 3.2 billion while the amount of passengers nationwide has increased in the past years.
That's a great question that I absolutely couldn't answer for you. The FAA has gone many times to Congress asking for an increase in the AIP authorization. You can sometimes see the difference between the authorization and the appropriation. There will be a difference in the funding levels, but at the end of the day, it comes down to what is appropriated. To be honest, it's based on the needs that are presented within the NIPIAS, and also what funding is available. The AIP grant program is by far the largest grant program within the FAA. It's the 3.35 billion accounts for. If you look at the full FAA budget of approximately $14.5 to $15 billion, it's a large chunk of that. When they'll increase it and why they'll increase it, I'm not sure. That's definitely a question for Congress, though.
All right, well, thank you for your best efforts to trying to understand the actions of our elected leadership. So the last question is for, we'll start with Dafong, and anyone else can add in if they know. Has a U.S. public airport ever defaulted on its debt?
I know there are some technical default that some airport actually has, when they calculate the rate covenant, which is a technical calculation, they show a default. I don't want to name that airport, but other than that, I don't think that situation actually happens frequently. I don't know whether you will call Branson Airport because, we know they started and eventually they no longer have a commercial scheduled carrier. So I'm not familiar with that airport, but for the public-owned airport with a relatively good size, that really hasn't happened, I think.
Okay. Well, we're very fortunate to live in such a stable aviation and national system. So that concludes it for our question and answer session and the webinar. So I'd just like to wrap up by thanking our panelists. We really did have the great fortune of getting three of the top minds in the industry for this webinar, and so we're just very fortunate for you folks. And I think we're all done here. Pinar, do you have anything to add?
Nope, just want to thank everybody for participating and sticking with us as we went a little bit over. Hopefully you got the maximum information that you could out of this, and we definitely encourage you to check out those additional resources on the ACC webpage. Other than that, I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and thank you for attending.